How many times have you done everything you were supposed to do and still it was not enough? Think about it. You were attentive, you were kind, you were available. Maybe you were even too generous, too patient, too present, and yet at some point something failed, something you could not name, something you did not see coming. And the most confusing part of all is that while you were giving all of that, there was another man somewhere, probably giving less, probably not trying nearly as hard, and yet leaving a far deeper mark. Why? That question haunted me for years, and for a long time I searched for the answer in all the wrong places. In advice about how to speak, how to dress, what to say at the exact right moment, how to appear confident even when you were trembling inside. And all of that search brought me right back to the same starting point, confused, frustrated, and with the suspicion that I was missing something fundamental. The answer I eventually found was not in any modern manual. It was written more than 2,500 years ago by a man named Lao Tzu, a Chinese philosopher who, according to legend, wrote his masterpiece in a single night before disappearing forever. A text of barely 5,000 characters that has changed more lives than most entire libraries. That text is called the Tao Te Ching, and what that man understood about human nature is so precise, so exact, that it is almost frightening. Because Lao Tzu was not talking about seduction, he was not talking about techniques, he was not talking about how to impress anyone. He was talking about something much deeper and much more unsettling. He was talking about why certain human beings leave an indelible mark on the lives of others, not because of what they do, but because of what they are. And what is fascinating, truly fascinating, is that most of those characteristics go completely against what we have been taught to do. So, if at some point in your life you have felt that you give a lot and receive little in return, if you have felt that the harder you try, the less people seem to care, if you have had the feeling that there is something in you that never quite connects, never quite resonates, never quite stays engraved in the memory of the people who matter most to you, then what I am about to share with you today could change everything. But I will warn you now, it is not going to be what you expected to hear. There is something modern human beings have forgotten, something that got lost somewhere between the era of smartphones, voice messages, and carefully curated Instagram profiles, something tied to a quality that cannot be bought, cannot be faked, and cannot be learned over a weekend. Lao Tzu called it many things. Sometimes he called it the Tao, the way. Sometimes he called it Wu Wei, effortless action. But in essence, he was always talking about the same thing, the strength that comes from within, not from the surface. And there is one image he used over and over again to explain it, the image of water. Think about water for a moment. Water has no shape of its own. It adapts to any container. Water does not fight obstacles, it flows around them. Water does not boast about its strength, and yet it can wear through the hardest rock in the world if given enough time. Lao Tzu observed that there is nothing in the world more soft and weak than water, yet for attacking things that are firm and strong, there is nothing that can take precedence of it. Water flows downward, toward the humblest places, and yet every living creature depends on it to survive. Lao Tzu said that the wise man is like water. And what struck me most when I first read that is that this description perfectly matches the kind of man women never manage to forget. Not the man who shouts the loudest, not the one who takes up the most space in a room, not the one who always has an answer and a clever comment prepared, but the one who remains, the one who flows, the one who does not need to prove anything because what he is speaks louder than anything he could say. Today, I am going to talk to you about 5 characteristics, 5 traits that when they come together in one person create something that has no exact name in the modern vocabulary, but that everyone recognizes when they feel it. That sensation that there is someone different, someone you can never fully define, someone whose presence occupies a space in your mind long after they have gone. And before we begin, I need you to understand something crucial. What I am about to describe is not a list of behaviors you can imitate. It is not a costume you can put on in the morning and take off at night. If you try to use this as an instruction manual, it will fail because the people who leave a deep mark on others do not do it because they follow steps. They do it because they have done the inner work that most people avoid at all costs. So, the question is not how to act a certain way. The question is whether you are willing to become something different from what you are now. The first characteristic is called unshakable presence, and it is perhaps the hardest to understand because it goes directly against all our most basic instincts. Imagine an argument, one of those situations where tension rises, emotions flare up, where someone says something that hurts you or challenges you or makes you feel attacked. What do most people do? They react. They defend themselves. They attack back. Or they shut down completely and disappear. These are the three most common responses to conflict, and they all have one thing in common. They are completely predictable, and what is predictable is never magnetic. Lao Tzu said that the sage remains in serenity whatever happens and silently does his teaching. There is a principle in psychology known as emotional reactivity, and it basically describes the human tendency to be controlled by external stimuli. Someone provokes you, you react. Someone pressures you, you give in or explode. Someone ignores you, you become anxious. You are essentially an automatic response system, a button anyone can press to get exactly the reaction they expect. Now, imagine someone who does not work that way. Imagine someone who, in the middle of a heated argument, remains calm without becoming cold. Someone who listens without getting defensive. Someone who can receive harsh criticism, take a real pause, and respond from calm rather than from wounded ego. Not because he feels nothing, but because he has developed the ability to choose how he responds instead of simply reacting. That is what Lao Tzu described as the rock in the river. The river flows, the water crashes, the current pushes, and the rock remains. Not because it is insensitive, but because it is anchored in something the water cannot move. Lao Tzu taught that stillness is the ruler of movement. Emotional stability is not indifference. It is exactly the opposite. It is the ability to remain completely present in an intense situation without being dragged away by it. And that ability, when you see it in a real person, in a flesh and blood human being who stays calm while everything around him is falling apart, produces a very specific psychological effect. It creates trust. It creates safety. It creates the feeling that there is someone there who will not break when things become difficult. And attachment psychology tells us something very clearly. People are irresistibly drawn to those who make them feel safe, not to those who entertain us, not to those who impress us, to those who make us feel that the ground will not collapse beneath our feet. But here comes the part no one tells you. Calm is not achieved by suppressing what you feel. That is not calm. That is accumulated tension disguised as control. Lao Tzu wrote that purity and stillness are the correct principles for mankind. But that stillness must come from a genuine place, not from repression. Real calm, the kind people can feel and that magnetizes, comes from having processed your own discomfort so many times that it no longer terrifies you. It comes from having been in difficult situations enough times to discover that you can move through them without ceasing to be yourself. That is the difference between a man who appears calm and a man who radiates calm. And that difference, even if it cannot always be articulated in words, is felt immediately and unmistakably. As Jung observed, the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. When your calm is a persona, a mask, people feel the effort behind it. When your calm is genuine, when it flows from a deep integration of your own shadow, people feel the authenticity. The second characteristic is the one that confuses people the most because at first glance it seems like a contradiction. It is called loving detachment. And when I say that, the most common reaction is to think it means being cold, distant, or unwilling to show what you feel. Wrong. Completely wrong. That is not detachment. That is fear disguised as indifference. The detachment spoken of in Taoism is something entirely different. It is the ability to love fully without needing, to commit yourself to someone without making them your reason for existing, to desire without clinging. Lao Tzu wrote that he who is detached from all things is one with them. And although it sounds philosophical and abstract, it has very concrete and very powerful psychological consequences. There is research by psychologist Arthur Aaron on the mechanisms of romantic attraction that reveals a result many people find unsettling. Moderate uncertainty about another person's feelings significantly increases the intensity of romantic interest, not total uncertainty, not cold, calculated games. The kind of uncertainty that naturally arises when you are in front of someone who genuinely has a life of their own, a direction of their own, a purpose that does not depend on you. When someone needs you too much, when you can feel that their entire happiness depends on what you do or fail to do, something inside you begins to pull away, not always consciously. Sometimes you do not even understand it in the moment, but something inside you perceives the weight of that expectation and wants to escape because extreme neediness, even when accompanied by genuine affection, creates a pressure that eventually suffocates what was once attraction. Lao Tzu advised that letting go is better than filling to the brim. By contrast, when you are in front of someone who clearly chooses you without needing you, someone who is fine with or without you, someone who shares their life with you because they want to, not because otherwise they would be lost, that produces something completely different. It creates curiosity. It creates desire. It creates the feeling that this person's presence in your life is a gift you could lose, not an endless obligation. Lao Tzu said it in a way that left me speechless the first time I read it. Hold without possessing, act without expecting, lead without dominating. It is almost impossible to read that and not think of someone you know, someone who perfectly fits that description, and recognize that this person has an effect on you that you cannot fully explain with logic, because real detachment, the kind born from inner fullness rather than fear of rejection, communicates something without saying a single word. It communicates that you have something valuable to protect, that your attention is not unlimited or automatic, that choosing yourself is not selfishness but dignity, and that silent communication is exponentially more powerful than anything you could ever say out loud. Knowing yourself is true wisdom, mastering yourself is true power, and that power, born of self-mastery, is what makes detachment so compelling. The third characteristic may surprise you because we live in an age obsessed with talking, with giving opinions, with always having something to add, with proving that we know, that we understand, that we thought of it before anyone else. And in that context, what I am about to tell you sounds almost subversive. Silence is more powerful than words. Not just any silence, not the awkward silence of someone who does not know what to say, not the passive-aggressive silence of someone who stays quiet to punish. The silence of someone who truly listens, someone who is completely present with what another person is saying without already preparing their response. Someone who can withstand the weight of a difficult emotion without needing to fill the entire space with words just to make it more manageable. Lao Tzu observed that people who talk do not know, while the wise one keeps silent. There is something therapists learn during their years of training that most people never discover. The ability to hold silence is one of the most powerful tools in any human relationship, because when someone speaks and you truly listen, not only with your ears, but with your full attention, without judgment, without rushing, without the urge to interrupt or immediately offer solutions, you are giving them something incredibly rare in the modern world. You are giving them the experience of being truly seen, and neurologically speaking, that activates brain circuits very similar to those involved in falling in love, because feeling deeply understood by another person triggers oxytocin, the hormone associated with bonding and trust. And when someone becomes the person in whose presence you feel most seen, most heard, and most understood, they automatically become someone you want to be around. But there is more. There are men who talk a lot in order to impress, to prove themselves, to occupy space and assert presence. And there are men who speak little because what they say carries weight, because they choose their words carefully, because they allow themselves to think before responding. And there is an enormous difference in how each one is perceived, even if it is difficult to articulate exactly why. The first entertains you, the second makes you think. And the people who make you think are the ones who stay with you mentally long after the conversation has ended. Lao Tzu wrote that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. There is a mystery to the man who does not reveal everything at once, who leaves space for the other person to wonder. That is not calculated mystery. It is the natural result of someone who is not desperate to fill every silence. All things in nature work silently. They come into being and possess nothing. That silent power is what makes nature so compelling, and it is what makes the man who embodies it equally compelling. Fourth characteristic. This is the one that creates the most resistance, especially in men who grew up with the idea that showing vulnerability is the same as showing weakness. And I want to destroy that belief here and now with concrete facts, because it is one of the most damaging lies we have been told. The humility of power, not performative humility, not the man who says he knows nothing just to appear approachable or to get others to reassure him that he does know something. That is manipulation disguised as modesty. Real humility comes from security, not insecurity. It belongs to the man who does not need anyone to confirm his worth because he already knows it. And precisely because he knows it, he does not need to go around proclaiming it. Lao Tzu wrote that he who humbles himself shall be preserved entire. There is a psychological phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which basically describes how people with limited knowledge tend to overestimate their competence, while truly knowledgeable people tend to be more cautious in their claims. Because the more you know about something, the more clearly you see everything you still do not know. The miscalculation of the incompetent stems from an error about the self, whereas the miscalculation of the highly competent stems from an error about others. And this translates directly into emotional life. The man who constantly needs to prove he is right, who cannot admit when he is wrong, who treats conversations like competitions to be won, who interrupts, corrects, and always has to add his opinion even when nobody asked for it. That man is screaming his insecurity for everyone to hear, even if he does it with a confident voice and polished arguments. And by contrast, the man who can naturally say, "I was wrong," who can hear criticism without becoming defensive, who can treat the waiter and the CEO with the same respect without changing his behavior based on the social status of the person in front of him. That man radiates something priceless, authenticity. Lao Tzu said that the true master does not proclaim his mastery. He who is great must make humility his base. And there is a reason that image resonates so deeply, because authenticity, real authenticity, the kind that has no agenda and needs no audience, is possibly the rarest and most magnetic quality a human being can possess. Because in a world full of people constructing improved versions of themselves to project outward, finding someone who simply is becomes extraordinary. And what is extraordinary is never forgotten. As Jung noted, the persona is that which in reality one is not. When you drop the persona, when you stop performing, you become real. And real is unforgettable. The fifth characteristic is the quietest of all, the one that makes the least noise, the one that, paradoxically, leaves the deepest mark, kindness without witnesses. There is a fundamental difference between doing good in order to be seen doing it and doing good because you are someone who does good. The difference is not always visible in the moment, but over time it always reveals itself. And people, especially with time and distance, always end up sensing the real motivation behind gestures. Human beings have an astonishing ability to detect authenticity, even when they cannot articulate exactly why something feels genuine or not. We have specialized neural circuits, so-called mirror neurons, that allow us to read the intentions of others with a precision that goes far beyond consciousness. And that means that when someone acts from the desire to be perceived a certain way, no matter how skillfully they do it, something in us registers it. The man who is kind when it costs him something, who helps when nobody is watching, who remembers the small details of the lives of the people he cares about without needing reminders that he cares, who gives his time or energy without keeping score of what others owe him, that man builds something no tactic, no technique, and no manual can replicate: emotional credibility. And emotional credibility is exactly what separates the man who leaves a passing impression from the man who leaves a permanent mark. Because impressions fade, brilliant moments are forgotten, but the way someone made you feel when there was no reason for them to do so, when there was nothing to gain from it, when the gesture came from a place that needed no witnesses, that does not disappear. Lao Tzu described it as acting for the benefit of all without competing with anyone. And he added something I consider one of the deepest thoughts I have ever read. Precisely because he does not compete, no one can compete with him. Stop for a moment and think about that. Precisely because he does not compete, no one can compete with him. How much energy do you spend comparing yourself to others? How much mental space is occupied by the question of whether you are enough compared to someone else? How many decisions do you make, not from what you genuinely want, but from what positions you better in relation to others? That is the game of the ego, and the ego always loses in the long run because there is always someone with more talent, more money, more charisma, more of whatever it is you are using to measure yourself. But the man who acts from his values, who builds from within, who is not playing the comparison game because he has already found his own game, that man has no competition. Not because he is the best at something, but because he is completely himself. Lao Tzu taught that by practicing Wu Wei and making no attempts, one makes no failures, and because he does not grasp anything, he has nothing to lose. When you are not grasping for validation, when you are not competing for approval, you become free. And freedom, genuine freedom from the need to prove yourself, is perhaps the most attractive quality a human being can possess. And this is where everything I have said converges into something I think is important for you to understand before we finish. None of these 5 characteristics is a personality trait you are simply born with or without. It is not a matter of genetic luck or favorable circumstances. Every single one of them is the result of a process, a slow, uncomfortable, sometimes frustrating process that requires something even rarer than time and money, radical honesty with yourself. Because you cannot develop unshakable presence if you are unwilling to look directly at the things that destabilize you. You cannot practice detachment if you have not identified where your need for control comes from. You cannot truly listen if you are still too busy protecting yourself to let in what another person is saying. You cannot be authentically humble if your self-worth depends on validation from others. And you cannot give genuinely if deep down you are keeping an invisible ledger of what others owe you. All of this requires inner work. And inner work is exactly the kind of effort modern culture has taught us to avoid, postpone, or replace with things that are more immediate and more comfortable. But there is something no external stimulus can give you, something no achievement, conquest, or recognition can replace. And that is the feeling of knowing yourself so deeply that nothing outside of you can shake you anymore. That is what Taoism calls Ming, knowledge of one's own nature. And according to Lao Tzu, it is the root of all real strength. Knowing others is wisdom. Knowing yourself is enlightenment. He who knows others is learned. He who knows himself is wise. There is one last thing I want to tell you, and it is perhaps the most important thing we have talked about today. The man women remember, the one who appears in conversations with friends years later, the one who still occupies a corner of their memory even after they have built a completely new life. That man was almost never perfect. He was almost never the most handsome, the most successful, or the most confident all the time. But he had something others did not have. Coherence between who he was inside and what he showed on the outside. He did not play games. He did not calculate. He did not strategically construct himself to create a certain effect. He simply was deeply, irrevocably himself. And in a world where almost everyone wears a mask, someone without one becomes disturbing, uncomfortable, impossible to categorize, impossible to forget. Jung warned that what is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate. If you do not bring your own nature to consciousness, if you do not integrate your shadow, you will be driven by forces you do not understand. The man who leaves a mark is the man who has done that work. He has faced his shadow, integrated his persona, and become whole. And wholeness, not perfection, is what people cannot forget. So the question is not how to become the man who leaves a mark. The question is, what part of yourself you are hiding that if you revealed it would change everything? You do not need to have everything figured out. You do not need to have reached some final destination. You do not need to be the finished version of yourself to start living from a place that is more real, more honest, and deeper than the one you inhabited yesterday. The Tao Te Ching begins with a phrase that has challenged translators for centuries. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, and I think that is exactly what makes certain people so impossible to forget. They cannot be completely named. There is always something more. Every time you think you understand them, you discover another layer. That is not manufactured mystery. It is not calculated distance. It is the natural consequence of being someone who never stops growing, questioning, and deepening. It is the consequence of choosing the difficult path of self-knowledge instead of the comfortable path of appearances. And that path has no map, no instructions, no guarantees. But it has something the other path does not, the possibility of taking you exactly where you want to be. The decision, as always, is yours. Lao Tzu wrote that the highest perfection is like imperfection. The man who is perfectly polished, who has no rough edges, who never says the wrong thing, who never shows a crack, that man is not real. He is a performance. And performances, no matter how brilliant, are forgotten once the show is over. The man who is real, who has imperfections, who shows his humanity, that man is remembered. Because real is rare, and rare is unforgettable. The soft overcomes the hard, the weak overcomes the strong. That is the lesson of water. That is the lesson of Lao Tzu. That is the lesson of the man who leaves a mark. He does not try to be strong in the way the world defines strength. He is strong in the way water is strong. He yields, he adapts, he flows. And in doing so, he wears down the hardest resistance. Not through force, but through persistence. Not through aggression, but through presence. Not through trying, but through being. If you made it all the way to the end, comment, "I made it," and I will personally reply to you myself. And if this resonated with you, subscribe to become part of it and leave a like if you enjoyed it.